Welcome back. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in London this week, attending the G7 nations meeting for the world's top diplomats and development officials. And here to discuss it is Rachel Rizzo. She's the Director of Programs at the Truman Center for National Policy here in Washington, D.C. Rachel, thank you for joining us. Today's meeting, which will last a few more days, is the G7 summit for heads of state. Leads into the one for heads of state, which should include Biden and other heads of state. What is the big question mark, though, about Russia and China?
So, focusing on countering Russian and Chinese propaganda is going to be a huge focus of this G7 foreign ministers meeting, which will be the first time that these foreign leaders have met in person since the last 2 years. And so that's going to be a major conversation about how to counter Russian and Chinese disinformation and propaganda regarding U.S. elections and other elections in Western democracies, as well as vaccine propaganda as well.
So it's safe to assume that even though Russia got kicked out of what used to be the G8 several years ago and is now the G7, that Putin will be watching when Secretary Blinken spends the latter part of his week in the Ukraine. Is there a danger to the United States promising too much or provoking a confrontation with Russia at this time?
Look, I think it's very clear that the Biden administration has no desire, nor does anyone else have any desire, to escalate with Russia. However, as we saw during Biden's speech, a joint speech to Congress last week, he's willing to push back on Russia and punish them for their bad behavior. As we've seen over the last month or so, Russia has amassed troops on the Ukrainian border, and I think Secretary Blinken's trip there really does show that the United States isn't going to mess around, and we aren't going to stand for Russia's bad behavior.
You also mentioned, COVID-19 and vaccine disinformation. There's also a concern of just vaccine access. It was interesting that though the G7 is supposed to be of the world's richest economies, they did invite this time India, South Korea, South Africa, and Australia, countries that normally are not included. How much of the coronavirus pandemic plays into recognizing that these countries also need to have a seat at the table?
I think this plays a huge part of it. As you saw, the foreign minister of India, Jay Shankar, is invited to the G7 this week. And as we've seen over the last few weeks, India has just had a horrible outbreak of the coronavirus disease over there, and it's been absolutely devastating. And so the world's 7 richest countries coming together, really trying to figure out a way to make sure that poor nations have access to the vaccine and can get out of this COVID-19 disaster in the same way that Western democracies have been able to. And so that's going to be a major conversation on the docket for this week. Not only access to vaccines, but talking about how developing countries can recover from the ongoing and long-term impacts of the coronavirus.
Well, that recovery in the developing world is going to be critical. There's another focus of the Biden administration, and particularly in the first 100 days, have been the elevation of human rights. And that's also been a challenge with, say, Russia, China, and Iran. How do you see this balance of idealism and realism playing out, knowing that, for example, on climate change, the United States and these G7 countries will have to work with China?
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance. And I would point again at Biden's speech to Congress last week, where he couched that conversation in a much broader geopolitical struggle between democracies and authoritarianism. And if democracies are going to win the day, as he said that we must, then we have to focus on things like human rights. And we have seen the United States and Europe come together sanction Russia, sanction China for its ongoing abuses of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang and its quelling of democratic movements in Hong Kong. And so I think you are seeing Western democracies do more on human rights. And it's a welcome change from what we saw during the 4 years of the Trump administration. And I think that we should expect to see more of this from Biden and the leaders of his administration over the next few years as well.
And that certainly seems to be the case with at least the goals of the administration to really bring back a rules-based order and like-minded countries coordinating together as allies. And we'll keep in touch to see how that directly translates onto on the ground in direct action. Rachel Rizzo, thank you for joining us from the Truman National Security Project.